Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson, and I'm a physician assistant and a member of the Medicating Normal team, where I volunteer doing outreach for the film and facilitating important conversations like this one. Today, I'm so excited to bring you this interview with Professor John Reed. Dr. Reed is professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London. He's published over 180 research papers, primarily on the relationship between adverse life events and psychosis. He also researches the negative effects of biogenetic causal explanations of prejudice, the experiences of recipients of anti-psychotic and antidepressant medication, electroconvulsive therapy, and the role of the pharmaceutical industry. Professor Reed is chair of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal and on the board of the Hearing Voices Network, England. He was the BPS representative on the expert advisory panel for the 2019 Public Health England's report of the review of the evidence for dependence on and withdrawal from prescribed medicines. And he's been the editor of the scientific journal Psychosis for 11 years and is the editor and author of several books, including Models of Madness and A Straight Talking Introduction to the Causes of Mental Health Problems. So thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Reed. I'm really excited to talk to you. And is there anything else you would like to say about yourself that I left out as a sort of an introduction, or if you've seen Medicating Normal, thoughts on the film, that sort of thing?
No, that was a pretty good introduction. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is kind of a loaded question to get us started, but I realize not everyone who's watching, may be familiar with you or your work. So what are some of, I guess, like the general positions that you take on the topics of psychiatry, diagnoses, psychiatric medications, that kind of thing?
Well, I have quite I suppose a simple approach to the causes of mental health problems. I think primarily human distress is caused by distressing things happening, which is, and depression is caused by depressing things happening, which is a fairly common sense position. I mean, there's a lot of research that proves that to be the case, of course, but I'm not sure you need research to demonstrate something so obvious. But the problem is our mental health system, especially in the United States, but around the world, is so heavily medicalized that obvious truth gets lost very often. Mm-hmm. And we have a system that tends to reach for labels and pills before they have taken the time to understand what's going on in a person's life and what they actually need. Mm-hmm. So that's my basic position on all of it, really. I've always been, since my early years and working in my very first job as a psychiatric nursing attendant in New York many years ago, I could never quite understand why mental health staff, not all of course, but it's more a systemic thing, because there's some obviously very good individuals in the mental health system, but the whole system pushes towards not asking people what's going on, not listening to the explanations that people try to give, and pathologizing everything. So instead of asking what's happened to people, we ask what's wrong with them, and then try and come up with a label that explains it. But unfortunately, our psychiatric labels don't explain anything at all. So that's my basic sort of starting position.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned something, especially in the United States, you said. So I'm aware that you've worked in many countries, including the United States and the UK. What do you think, are the problems pretty much fundamentally the same, or what makes you say especially the United States?
They are essentially the same all over the world, but I say especially the United States because the States has a particularly biological or biogenetic approach And that's largely because of the influence of drug companies in the States is even greater than elsewhere in the world. I mean, the States is one of 2 countries that allows direct to consumer advertising. Now, if you live in a state, you take it for granted that every 3rd advertisement is, or it's probably an exaggeration, but many advertisements on TV or whatever are drug company ads, sort of pushing the model that if you're upset, you need one sort of a pill or another. That's illegal in almost every other country. New Zealand is actually the only other place where that's allowed, but it doesn't happen very much. So the influence of the drug companies in the United States is phenomenal. If you look at let's just take the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual produced by the American Psychiatric Association. 60% of the people on those committees were in the pay of drug companies, designing the Bible of mental health around the world. And in terms of my area of schizophrenia and psychosis, every single member of the committee was in the pay of the drug companies, one way or another. So it's a very powerful influence. And the drug companies don't waste their money. They know how to spend money to influence all of us. And what they try to do, of course, is to make us believe that our distress is an illness that requires a biological explanation and a biological fix. That's their job. Can't blame them, really. Their job is to maximize profit for their shareholders. Right. Who I do blame is the profession of psychiatry, who has basically forgotten how to maintain an ethical professional boundary between itself and the pharmaceutical industry.
So, but just to be clear, in the UK where you are now, these problems do exist. I mean, we just did a screening with some NHS doctors, and immediately after the film ended, it was the post-screening discussion. And the first thing that was said was, oh, well, this is in America. We don't do this so much here in the UK. So what do you think about that?
Oh, no, it's not categorically different. It's a dimension. I think we are slightly less medicalized here. So I would say the States is the worst. Australia is almost as bad. We are, I mean, one gauge I always use as to whether or not we're making any progress is what percentage of people are prescribed antipsychotics within 48 hours of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the answer in the UK is 98%.
Wow.
So, and I'm not saying nobody should ever use antipsychotics, but that is, I can't imagine in medicine as many as a percentage is as high as that. Whereas these drugs are largely ineffective compared to placebo, marginal benefit, and have huge adverse effects that really mess up people's lives. And yet they are the first line of treatment. They should be at the absolute last resort when everything else has been tried. So Britain is very medicalized. We have pockets, as you do, we have pockets of excellence, pockets where a psychosocial or multidisciplinary approach dominates, but they're only pockets. And yeah, the major model here is also medical. But I just think it's there's less debate in the States. I think it's quite difficult for mental health professionals to go against the grain in the States. They can be penalized and vilified quite easily, I think. So I think there's more room for discussion and disagreement in Europe, whereas in the States, especially for psychiatrists, a psychiatrist who didn't go along with the idea that all these problems are caused by chemical imbalances would probably be drummed out of the business pretty quickly.
Yeah.
A very brave psychiatrist in the States who goes against the grain.
So I always am curious when I meet people who come to this work and are critical of, the way things are currently in the mental health system and psychiatry. how they came to their position, because all of the teaching and everything is against, a lot of the things that you've just explained here in the first 15 minutes of our talking. So I'm curious how you started questioning.
Good question. But I think, well, I mean, we know from surveys around the world that the public, again, I'm afraid America is an exception, but in every other country, the average member of the public starts from a psychosocial position. When you do surveys around the world of what causes mental health problems, everywhere except the States lists things like poverty, stress at home, stress at work, unemployment, violence, trauma, rape, war, etc., etc. So I think we all sort of grow up with the basic. We start off with a basic understanding that bad things happen and they screw us up. That's the basic position we all start from, because it's so obvious, because we see it and we know from our own lives something bad happens and we're upset. So we know that this is true. So it's more like how. I think the better question in a way is how do some of us not have that drummed out of us? And I don't know the answer to that. I guess my first job as I say, in New York as a nursing attendant, I just saw the difference between the most nursing attendants. A lot of them were actually Vietnam vets, interestingly, the attendants. The difference between people who still believe that and the psychiatrists who took a different approach. And you could just see that it didn't work. So they were distancing themselves from the individual they were trying to help. They didn't mean to be, but they were pathologizing them, labeling them, keeping them at a distance. So, and the person doesn't respond and you don't get any change. So I could just see that approach just doesn't work. And I think that is obvious to most people. I think it's really only one profession, and it's not everybody in that profession, even say half of one profession, that has this rather strange idea that if you're upset, then there must be something wrong with your brain. And outside of the developed world, if that's the right term, nobody believes that. I mean, I was 20 years in New Zealand and learned a lot from Maori people there that could not understand this idea that if someone's upset or distressed or crazy or whatever, then the problem lies within that individual. I mean, the first thing they always did when someone went crazy, or whatever words you want to use, was to gather together the entire family and everybody else they could think of and sit down and figure out what have we got to do together.
Yeah.
So it's a rather long-winded answer to your question. So.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I've often thought, like, I hear people talk about like dogs that were rescued a lot, and they can make the connection with a pet, an animal, like, oh, he probably behaves that way because of his life history, or we don't know where he came from or what maybe happened to him, but we don't give the same ideas to human beings sometimes, Yeah, it makes total sense.
I think that's right, and it's sad. I think it's also sad for the professionals who take that stance, that their jobs must be so unsatisfying, because they never have that, or very rarely have that lovely feeling that you get when you do listen and you are able to connect with somebody's pain and where it's come from, and how appreciative we are of one another when we do that for one another, whether that's as friends or as a paid professional. It's a very satisfying human feeling. And I think the psychiatrists who adopt this narrow biogenetic view of human distress are missing out on that. So I mean, it's a shame for them as well, really.
Yeah. So all of this kind of sounds very simple to me. What you're saying is, bad things happen to people or depressing things happen, and you get, depression and mood changes and things like that as a result. But you wrote a book called A Straight Talking Introduction to the Causes of Mental Health Problems. And the description of the book says the causes of mental health problems are more complicated than we would like or that we understand. So can you speak to that a little bit? What is more complicated?
Well, yes, it's more complicated than that very basic, simple idea. That's the building block from which it all starts. But of course, two of us can have the same depressing thing happen and have different reactions. So that's where it starts getting complicated. So let's take a shy teenager. No, it doesn't have to be shy. A teenager who finally gets up the courage to ask somebody out, and they go to the agreed meeting place and the other person doesn't show up. There's a whole range of responses that can have. At one end, the rather arrogant but self-protective end is, well, I'm better off without somebody who's so stupid they don't want to be with me. And at the other end is, oh God, that just proves that I'm completely unlovable and ugly and unworthy and I feel like dying. And everywhere in between. So the complexity comes in from why do people respond differently to the same event? And you can track that back always to what happened earlier. So, and especially the first 5 years of life. I'm not saying we're totally set in our ways by age 5, but a lot of our emotional response patterns are pretty strongly dependent on what level of attachment we have, secure attachment with at least one, preferably 3, 4, 5 people, as we're growing up as little ones. That sort of shapes how we experience relationships and how easily we're hurt when things go wrong, and how clingy we are or not, etc., etc. So yes, it is different for each individual. That's what I mean by complexity. But still within that, you can trace the differences also to bad things that happened. So even with, like, say, this ridiculous idea of paranoid schizophrenia or paranoid psychosis, which is sort of an extreme end of the biological model of mental health. Obviously, if you've been done in enough times in your life, you're going to be scanning for the next time somebody does you in. And you're going to scan to be safe. You have to scan beyond reality, because you can't just scan this side of the danger, because you'll get hurt. So you have to scan, you have to see it even when it isn't there to make sure you're safe. And that's paranoia. And how so obviously comes from bad things happening. And yet there are some mental health professionals can't grasp that simple fact. So that's what I meant by the complexity.
Somebody actually just asked a question in the audience that is about what you're talking about right now. And they say, why are psychiatrists and psychologists so afraid of someone experiencing psychosis or other extreme states?
Well, if we look at it from their point of view, and I think there is a difference between psychologists and psychiatrists, but I would say that because I'm a psychologist. But to try and be sympathetic to the mental health professionals who are overly frightened or worried, who gets the blame when somebody does do something bad? And I don't want to fall into the stereotype of the dangerous mental patient, but some proportion of people who are extremely distressed deal with that distress by either hurting themselves or hurting other people. And when that happens, everybody wants someone to blame. And it very often is the psychiatrists, to be fair. And so they are under a lot of pressure from all of us, well, from society, to keep everybody safe from craziness. So I think that's a part of why they often overreact and are frightened of craziness or madness. But the other part of it is the training. the human sensitivity that most psychiatrists start with when they go into their training is systematically trained out of them at medical school. And a lot of the training is directly drug company funded. You have to remember that. Pretty much in your country, in the States, pretty much all training and education after graduation, all continuing medical education is pretty much funded by the drug companies. So the training is very is a big part of the picture. And when you have to toe that biomedical line to pass your exams, you start believing in it at some point.
Yeah.
Every culture has always had this small group of people, whether it's, I mean, historically it would be witches or whatever. Currently it's crazy people, schizophrenics, who are, you know, the 1% of the craziness, hold the craziness for the rest of society. That means it helps us all feel that, well, we're not crazy. They're the crazy ones. I'm sane, and I'm really, really different from them. So this whole idea of this sort of diagnostic label of schizophrenia makes us all feel a little bit sane, unless we're unlucky enough to get the diagnosis, of course. So that's a bit convoluted, but so I think there's several reasons for that fear.
Yeah. All right, so let's move to antidepressants. You've done a lot of research on antidepressants, and I'm wondering, in, you know, all of your research, have you concluded that antidepressants are effective or safe compared to what the public is being told about antidepressants?
Okay, so there's two sides to that, to every treatment, and there's a safety and efficacy. So let's start with the efficacy. About 10 years ago, a guy called Irving Kirsch got hold of all the drug company studies that had been buried for years, many years, because you only have to, drug companies only have to provide 2 studies to the FDA to get a drug license. So they often will conduct 10, 15, 20 studies that don't have show any efficacy at all. And they just keep going until almost on a random basis, they come up with a study that does show efficacy. Irving and his colleagues got hold of all the buried ones. And when they analyzed all of the studies that had ever been done, they found that only for about 2% of people were antidepressants better than placebo.
Wow.
Now, I have to quickly say that doesn't mean they don't work, because placebo works.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad thing. Placebo, I mean, it's Latin for "I please," interestingly. So placebo, just to make sure people understand, is that benefit we get when we go see a doctor or anybody. And even if they give us a pill, we still feel like they've listened to us, they've cared enough to do something, they agree that there's something wrong with us and we need help, which is sometimes a nice feeling, to feel that somebody's helping you. They believe that the drugs work, and they're a doctor, so we tend to believe doctors by and large, which is a good thing most of the time. So placebo is fine, but the problem is the side effects. But before we go on to those, the 2% for whom the drugs do actually work are right at the very, very extreme end of the severe, this sort of mild, moderate, and severe depression. It's the ones right at the top, and they do get a small benefit compared to placebo. So that's important, but it basically means that for the vast majority of people who are on antidepressants, they would get the same benefit from taking an empty capsule, and that wouldn't matter if it wasn't for all the side effects. And the side effects are many and quite common. They're not rare. The major ones, which are quite depressing, are the emotional numbing that happens. So it's not, you end up not being able to feel anything, good or bad, which in a crisis can be a good thing for short term. I mean, I can imagine being so out of it, that I'd just like to be calmed down or whatever for a few days.
Mhm.
So there's emotional numbing, there's sexual dysfunction, which of course is quite depressing.
Mhm.
A lot of people experience increased suicidality. In the surveys that we've run, which are quite large online surveys, about 50% of people report feeling more suicidal, especially in the first few weeks. That does subside a bit, but that's quite an astonishing finding for a drug that's supposed to make you feel less depressed, and that they're actually increasing suicidality. And then, and the big new thing that we've really only started researching properly in the last few years is the withdrawal effects.
Mhm.
For decades, the professional organizations like the American Psychiatric Association and our Royal College of Psychiatrists, and of course the drug companies, all said, well, yes, we know that benzos are kind of addictive, but antidepressants are not. There's no problem with addiction or withdrawal effects or dependence. A few people have, a couple of weeks of very mild symptoms. And that is so far from the truth that has been a really negligent piece of misinformation that has been given to doctors and to patients. So we had a big government level review of dependence on prescribed medications a couple of years ago here, which I was involved in. And we did a review of all the literature on antidepressants, and amazingly, there were only 14 studies that had ever looked at what happens when you stop taking the drugs. Because of course, drug companies are not interested in funding research into how you get off the drugs. That's the last thing they're going to fund. So there were only 14, but the pattern was pretty clear. It was just over half of people experience withdrawal effects when they try and stop antidepressants. And about half of those describe those effects as severe.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of, well, actually millions of people around the world, given how many people are taking antidepressants, millions of people around the world right now trying to get off antidepressants, not getting support from doctors, because when they describe their symptoms to the doctor, 9 times out of 10, because the doctor has been misinformed, the doctor is going to say, oh, that's your illness coming back. So just as they're beginning to come off the medication, they find the medication increased. Which is quite sad. We've made a lot of progress on that in Britain. Even the Royal College of Psychiatrists has changed its position and put out a very strong statement last year warning about the severity and duration of antidepressant withdrawal. That was a major U-turn for them.
Yeah,
they're not known for their U-turns. So all credit to them. The American Psychiatric Association hasn't even begun to think about it, I don't think.
Yeah.
And the other thing about antidepressants, which is certainly true here, we're as bad as you are on this, is the number of people taking them. In Britain last year, and I know it's pretty much about the same in the States. Usually I can say the States is worse, but on this one we're about the same. 1 in 6 people are now taking, adults are now taking antidepressants every year. And because it's higher for women, that means 1 in 4 women, 1 in 4 are taking antidepressants. It's also higher, and I don't know if you've done research in the States, but in Britain, if you're living in a poor, deprived area, you're also more likely to be on antidepressants. So if you're a woman living where I live, and also for over 60s is higher. So I live in Newham, London, which is one of the poorest areas in the country. So if you're a woman over 60 living in Newham, you've probably got about a 50% chance of being on antidepressants. And I just find this staggering. I mean, this is an epidemic, an international epidemic of overprescribing. And that's before we add in the benzos and the anti-psychotics and all the other drugs. I find it quite scary that we have all, and we're all responsible for this. Because most of the time, nobody's making us take them. I understand when you're under the mental health legislation, you can be made to take drugs, but antidepressants, not usually. So we're all complicit in this. It's an astonishing state of it. I do not believe that 1 in 4 women in Britain is clinically depressed. Right. I really don't believe that. And if they were, then there must be something seriously wrong with our society.
Right.
And of course, there are a few things wrong with our society, but it's not that bad. So the drug companies have done an astonishing job of marketing this idea that if you're depressed, there's something, you've got a chemical imbalance that needs correcting. Not a shred of evidence for that. And even a lot of psychiatrists, certainly Britain, I don't know, in the States, people are beginning to admit that there never was any evidence of a chemical imbalance.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious, you mentioned the Royal College of Psychiatry doing a U-turn.
Yeah.
I imagine it didn't happen quickly. There's probably a lot of work put into getting that, brought to their attention and change made.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, with all the work that you've done to expose these issues, what kind of responses are you getting from, the powers that be or colleagues? And also patients. I've noticed that just being someone myself who's harmed by taking psychiatric medications, when I tell my story, a lot of times I encounter people who are taking the medications, and my motivation in telling my story is to help people, to inform, not to tell people what to do, but just to give the information that I wish I would have had. And a lot of times you're met with things like, oh, you must be a Scientologist, or you're pill shaming,
Anti-psychiatry.
you're contributing to the stigma. So they've done a really great job with this anti-stigma campaign, which I thought of when you were saying all of us are complicit. There's been some really wonderful marketing to get us there. So what kind of responses are you getting similar yourself, even though you have research to back you, or?
Well, you get a range of responses, obviously. I would say most people already, as I said, most people already know that there's a problem with our mental health system and approach to it. So many people are very grateful that what they sort of known intuitively has now been demonstrated empirically. That's quite satisfying. But yes, there's always backlash. Our sort of standing joke is that if we haven't been attacked this week, then we're not doing our job properly, which is kind of a silly cliche. But so yes, pill shaming, anti-psychiatry, yes, the Scientologist, we get that one. There's a hard, especially on social media, there's a hardcore of biologically oriented psychiatrists who are extremely threatened by any view other than their own, actually, other than the biomedical model, and can get quite vicious. And on a bad day, it can be quite upsetting. But I think it's even more upsetting for people who use the services, or patients, or whatever words you want to use. And I'm sorry to hear that you're getting those sorts of experiences. That's quite hard to put up with when you're just trying to share a story. But I'm sure I'm going to guess now that you also get a lot of support from like-minded people who are very grateful that you're speaking out. Is that?
Oh, yes. And people who were quiet for a long, long time. And then I'll get a little private message from them saying, I'm on 7 psychiatric drugs, and when I try to get out of bed in the morning, I can't stand up, and I'm 70, and can you help me? And they've been quiet the whole time. So sometimes I think you plant the seed and it takes a little while, and then they, come around to the message, and they see that what you're saying might not be so out there.
Yes. And certainly on all the Facebook support groups around the world, hundreds of thousands of people are doing the job for one another that professionals ought to be doing, especially around the withdrawal issues. So yeah, we get a mixed response. I get complaints into my university from time to time, saying exactly that. I'm especially around ECT. We've got a big campaign going on ECT at the minute, and we get accused of depriving people of a life-saving treatment by talking about the negative effects of ECT. But it's relatively easy for me. I'm in a relatively privileged position, but because I work mostly I work now in the university, I don't do clinical work anymore. But I think it can be hard for mental health professionals working within the system who speak out, as I said, especially in America, but also here, You do hear cases of people getting suspended or fired or whatever for not going along with the medical model, which is very sad. So, but I mean, another cliche we often share with one another in this struggle, because it is a struggle. It can be a depressing and painful struggle, but you sure meet the best people.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. Well, you're a psychologist, so I wonder what your thoughts are on this phenomenon of people not wanting the information. Like, I've always sort of likened it to, you know, if I'm driving my Toyota around and Toyota sends me a letter in the mail and says like, hey, there's a recall on your brakes or something, like, I'm thankful that that information was given to me. But when it comes to our mental health treatments and our medications, people, and it's not, obviously not everyone, but many who are taking the medications, it's almost like they don't want the information. What do you think that comes from?
Well, I think for some people, well, maybe for all of us to some extent, it's kind of easier just to take a pill. I mean, or it seems easier. I mean, the alternative is that we've got to face up to bad stuff going on in our lives, or that went on in our lives when we were little, or stuff that's going on now. We've got to maybe change some of our behaviors, and who likes to do that? I don't.
Yeah,
Especially at my age.
Yeah.
You know, what am I doing wrong? You know, what have I got to do differently so I'm not feeling so bad all the time? And so it takes work, and it takes facing up to some of the bad stuff that's going on in your life or in your head or whatever. So who wouldn't want to take a pill if there was a pill that just made you feel better and you didn't have to deal with all that, or find better ways of interacting with people and not being such a grumpy old bastard or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's quite an attraction. There is an attraction, isn't there, to this idea that, as I say to my undergraduate students, I recommend to them that they all pick make up their own diagnosis that they can use for the rest of their life every time they screw up, and they can say, well, I'm sorry, I've got squirkly bob disorder, and that's the sort of thing that people with squirkly bob disorder do. I mean, what can I do? You know, I can't help it. I've got this disorder which makes me do these things. So, and it's not that I've got to stop being, you know, rude to people, or I've got to find better ways of connecting with people, or I've got to do something about the fact that I'm in an abusive relationship or whatever. It's just that I've got this disorder, and you know, and that's that. So
yeah.
And I take the pills, and they help me feel a bit better sometimes, sort of. So anyway, in a long-winded way, I'm saying there's an attractive simplicity. And I think it's attractive for the professionals as well, because they don't have to think very much. I mean, how does it take 6 years to train how to count how many symptoms somebody's got and pick what color pill they need? How can that take 6 years to learn? So, yeah, I mean, it's a very simplistic model, and they don't have to feel anything. That's the other attraction for the professionals, for some professionals.
Yeah.
You distance, as I said earlier, you distance yourself from people's distress. And I think if you're going to see lots of people in a day who are really, really distressed, that can be quite useful to have a model that keeps you at a distance. So it does have some things going for it, the medical model. So I can kind of, to some extent, sympathize with people who don't want to hear you when you want to tell them your version of the truth.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. So you're currently doing research on antidepressants now, and we want to give people a link to participate. I don't have the link handy. Angie in the comments may have it, but if we don't have it right now, we will put it in the comments ASAP. Can you explain to people what the research is about and who would be eligible to participate?
Well, this particular survey we've got running, which is an international online survey, it's specifically for people who are in Facebook support groups.
Okay.
So actually, if you are in one of those groups and you wanted to take part, pretty much every large Facebook support group in the world has got access to that to the link to the survey. So it'll either be on the web page of your group, or the group leaders will have it already. So it's not for the general public, I'm afraid, on this occasion. We do surveys like that sometimes, but we're trying to, but you see, because professionals haven't been doing the work we should have been doing in terms of supporting people, we don't know what works. There's been no research on how the best way to support people getting off, or very little research. So the knowledge, as is often the case, is not with the professionals, it's with the patients. It's out there. They're all supporting one another on a daily basis. They know what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so we're basically stealing their knowledge. What I mean by that, we're trying to capture what they know and share it in another way through the professional community, so we can start teaching doctors what they already know and what the doctors ought to know. So that's why we're doing it. So the main questions are sort of what worked and what didn't work. And it won't be the same for everybody. There's no, like everything, there's no magic bullet. Some people like to get advice, tell me what to do, and some people hate getting advice.
Mm-hmm.
But there will be knowledge out there about how long it takes, how slowly you have to go. I mean, we do know some of this already. Since there's a reasonable audience out there, I must take the opportunity to share that if you are on antidepressants or antipsychotics or benzodiazepines, in case it isn't extremely obvious, most of the time, most people need to do it quite slowly and carefully and patiently, and reduce, as a very rough rule of thumb, reduce sort of 10% at a time, so that even towards the end, you're reducing 10% of a very low dose. So it's the hardest last bits of the dose that are the hardest to get off. And at that point, people really want to finish off and get there, and they throw the drugs away a little bit too soon. The last bit needs to be really slow. We do know that already. We know that from the physiology of the chemicals of the drugs. But anyway, that's what we're trying to do. I think we have over 1,000 at the minute. So, but we're leaving it open for a few more weeks to get as many as we can.
Okay. That sounds like really good research. I've thought all along, I've seen doctors and things bantering back and forth about, oh, how do we do this, or how do we, and I'm like thinking, if you want to know, we already know. The patients know. We could tell you, but they never want to come and ask. Not all of them, but some are curious and want to go to the patients. But I'm glad you are asking the patients, because you're right, there's a lot of knowledge in those groups. So so in your opinion, then, what is missing from the literature on antidepressants or any of the psychiatric medications? What do we need more research on?
Well, I think antipsychotics is the next big thing we need to focus on in terms of withdrawal, because the denial about that is still enormous. I mean, I think we've cracked it open on antidepressants, certainly in Britain and parts of Europe, and hopefully it'll reach the States soon. But on antipsychotics, no. I mean, people are very, very scared to help people come off antipsychotics, because this is the ultimate fear, is that if you come off antipsychotics, you're going to go kill somebody or kill yourself, or become extremely psychotic. And actually, it has been known since the 70s that when people come off antipsychotics, what's actually happening is if you unblock the dopamine system, because that's what those drugs do, especially if you've been on them for several years, if you unblock the dopamine system, the brain is overwhelmed with dopamine, and so you get extremes of feelings which are quite frightening and look like madness, and are misinterpreted as the psychosis coming back, and therefore it's like the antidepressants, only with this extra component, because it really can drive you mad to come off antipsychotics, especially if you do it too quickly. But nobody talks about the withdrawal process of antipsychotics. Just beginning to do. We've got one big study running in London now. Dr. Joanna Moncrief and her colleagues, who's a psychiatrist. but it's still very early days, and that's going to be the hardest one to crack, because the prescribers are terrified of, anybody on antipsychotics who goes to their doctor and says, "I'd like to come off, please," is immediately told, "Oh, no, 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 no." Very rare to find a doctor who will do the right thing and support somebody through a gradual reduction. So that's the next big area I think we need to focus on. We also don't know about the long-term effects after people have got off. We're finding more and more cases of people who have successfully, sometimes after years of trying, more from months, but occasionally years, they finally get off the antidepressants, and still a year or two later find that some of those adverse effects are still there, which is pretty depressing. So we don't know the extent of that, we really don't. And those people are going to need help. I also think they should be getting compensation. People who are damaged long-term from psychiatric drugs or ECT really ought to be getting financial compensation, but that's a long way off, I think.
Yeah. So it looks like we have 10 minutes left, and maybe we can take some of the audience questions of people who've been listening. One of them actually is relevant to what you just said. Somebody wants to know, what recourse do people have who are harmed by psychiatric drugs?
Well, I'm afraid very, very little. We need more lawsuits. There are some lawsuits that have been brought against drug companies, but that's few and far between, really. If you can attach yourselves to one of those class action lawsuits, that's one thing. But it's quite, in some ways, it's not easy to prove that is the cause of your difficulties. People will try and defend against that allegation by saying, well, it's all sorts of other things, or it is your illness. Like with ECT, we get a lot of kickback against the brain damage caused by ECT, and saying, well, depression causes memory loss, John. So it's a complicated business. So I'm afraid there isn't a lot of compensation around at the minute. In terms of ECT, there are several lawsuits underway at the minute, and also in the UK. And the good news on ECT is that one of the two manufacturers of ECT machines just went bankrupt because there were so many lawsuits against them, they couldn't get insurance.
Wow.
So that's how things are going to change in the courts, I think. I shouldn't say it as a professor, but research actually takes forever to change anything. But I think we have to get, especially in the States, I think we have to get them in the court more than we have done so far.
In the UK, do you know if you have the same, like here in the United States, we can't sue if something's a generic? Do you have that similar?
Well, we have a lot less suing over here in general. You're very sue happy, which is a mixed blessing. But yes, that basically the same sort of principles do.
Okay.
And to apply, but you yeah. So it's quite a hard business, and when you're struggling to deal with whatever it is you're struggling with, and the withdrawal effects, trying to get the energy to and the money to take on a law case is very, very difficult, I think.
Yeah, that would be a lot. And then you have to consider how much emotional distress it's going to cause, because the opposite side is going to say, you're mentally ill, or
yes, you're imagining that it's part of your illness. Yes, so that's can be quite distressing. So yeah, people shouldn't go into that lightly. So
this is a good question. This person says it's going to take a huge shift from psychiatry to improve the patient experience and prevent harm. So what do you think people can do to protect themselves in the meantime?
Well, in the meantime, finding alternatives to the mental health system is a good idea to consider. Having said that, of course, there are some very good psychiatrists, there's some very good psychologists, but the system as a whole can often do more harm than good. So, for instance, in my area of psychosis, one of the most exciting developments around the world is the Hearing Voices network. So in about 25 countries now, including in the States, quite strong foothold in the States, people are coming together who hear voices to support one another without labeling one another, and of course without medicating one another, and learning from one another's experiences about what works for you. And the goal is not to get rid of the voices. The goal is sometimes to understand the voices and find ways to live with the voices. And that's a very, very exciting development. It's just one example of alternatives. But at a I was going to say a lower level of distress, I shouldn't say that, but for depression, there's a big move here towards social prescribing. Doctors are beginning now, slowly, instead of prescribing antidepressants, to recommend exercise and yoga and dance and getting some way involved in your local community. All the things that common sense is make you feel better. Not the same for everybody. I mean, I crap at yoga and dancing and things, but
no yoga for you.
no yoga for me. But I mean, most people can find something that. I mean, the trick with depression is to try and remember when you weren't depressed, what used to make you happy. And do some of that, which I don't mean to simplify or minimize. I know it can, when you're feeling really depressed, the whole point is you haven't got the energy to do that. But you kind of have to find that energy somewhere and get some help to do the things that make you feel better. But also on depression, I mean, most of the sadness that people get prescribed antidepressants for passes with time. I mean, we are dishing out antidepressants for people who've just lost a loved one. That's grief. That's not something that needs to be medicated. So sometimes, and I don't mean to minimize people's distress, but sometimes sort of just doing nothing and waiting and accepting that this is maybe part of life, some of it.
Yeah.
But I realize sometimes people have really deep feelings of sadness for a long, long time, and then we do need help from one another.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I noticed too, Dr. Reed, is having to go through psychiatric drug withdrawal myself, all of the coping techniques that I should have used in the beginning to not take medications for, I had to use them to endure the distress of the withdrawal. So it's like, I feel like in some cases, at some point, you're going to have to use those tools anyways. And so it makes more sense to try them first before,
And why aren't we teaching those skills in schools?
Yeah.
That should be a core part of the curriculum. And I think that there's pockets of that as well. Although there's pockets of, and we have this terrible thing called mental first aid, where teaching kids all the wrong things. But we're talking about what we need to be teaching is emotional literacy, isn't it? How to feel comfortable with our feelings and other people's feelings, and how to make friends, and all of that stuff, which is at least as important as reading and writing.
Yeah.
So that's where it needs to begin, I think.
Yeah. So on that same topic, then someone says, I'm doing my PhD in public policy on this topic. What kind of public policy changes could help these issues?
Well, the first one is to massively move money away from mental health services into the first 5 years of life. Now, I get in a lot of trouble for saying that, obviously, because we do need mental health services. But if we closed all the psychiatric hospitals like they did in Italy in the 1970s, took that money and put it into something that works, because one day we will actually learn that it is not a good idea to gather the most distressed and distressing 100 people in the community and put them in the same building. One day we will figure out that is a really silly thing to do. So, but to be more, well, it is serious, but so from a public policy point of view, we currently allocate the budget in exactly the wrong way. So the older we get, the more money we spend on. So I'm getting pretty old now, so I will get more than my fair share of social services and things. That money needs to go into the first 5 years of life. If we can make as many as possible of our children safe and secure in those 5 years of life, we would do away with most mental health problems later. And then money into schools, as I said, to teach emotional literacy. So that's very simple. Obviously, there's lots of other things need doing as well. But if I had to pick two, it would be those two.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think we're at time, but I want to give you a chance to, Angie did find the link, by the way. So the
Oh,
link
good.
to your
Oh,
most
thank you,
current,
Angie.
yeah, it's in the
Doing my
comments.
job for me.
Yeah, for anybody who qualifies, can complete that. And before we go, Professor Reed, where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work, or anything else you want to add as some closing thoughts? Please do.
Well, I have a website at the University of East London, which is fairly easy to find if you just Google that. But as a final thought, I guess, some people listening, either mental health professionals or people struggling with emotional difficulties, or whatever, it can be quite a lonely business, either going through what you're going through in your own life or trying to change the system. It takes a long time. But just know that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world dealing with the same issues, and lots of people around the world, including in the States, trying to change the system. And despite all the criticisms that I've said tonight, doing very, very good work within the system. There's some wonderful people in our mental health system whose jobs are made harder because of the system they work in, but they are quite wonderful human beings. And that this struggle I've now been involved with for 40, 50 years, and I'll end with that same cliche. It's a very, very hard struggle, but you really do meet the best people. And it's been a pleasure meeting you this evening.
Yeah, same. I could talk to you probably for another couple of hours. Maybe we'll have you back to talk more about ECT, since we didn't get to cover that.
Happy to do that.
Okay. Angie's telling me, since you're part of the Hearing Voices Network, she actually interviewed somebody last week.
Oh, good.
Let me pull up her name, Jeannie Bass, I believe. There was an episode last week about the Hearing Voices Network. So if anybody's curious about learning more about that, they can go watch last week's episode.
Excellent.
So I'm going to close us out now. Thank you everyone so much for joining us.
Thanks everyone.
Okay, let's see, I just have to read a little thing here. There's more interviews to come. If you haven't seen Medicating Normal yet, check our website at medicatingnormal.com/watch, where you can see a list of upcoming community screenings. We're actually going to be on
best mental health film in the last 10 years.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. We're actually going to be on public television starting January, and all of those dates we have are going to be posted on our website soon, and we're updating the dates as they come in. So keep an eye on that so you can watch in your local area if you're in the United States, and you can tell your friends and family to tune in as well. And if you'd like to support our outreach efforts to bring the film and conversations like these to communities worldwide, you can make a donation at medicatingnormal.com/donate. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Reed, for spending an hour with me. It's been a pleasure and great to finally meet you. And thank you so much for all your work in this space. It's so impactful and important, and I hope you'll keep doing what you're doing. So
thanks for having me.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.